welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and I'm still talking about March of the Machine here. And I've already talked about my 10 best cards for the Commander format, and I also talked about the best commanders from this set. Now I'm going to be talking about sort of the leftovers, cards that I think likely will see play in the Commander format, but not good enough to make my top 10 list, and maybe in some cases are questionable whether they're going to see play in the Commander format. And I'm going to start off with some cards that I'm sure people might even be surprised I didn't have my top 10 list. Complete the Circuit would be one. 5 and a blue instant. Has Convoke, and you may cast sorcery spells this turn as though they had flash. That's not bad. More importantly though, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell twice. You may choose new targets for the copies. And this definitely could be a finisher in the Commander format. I really don't know how much play this card is going to see. Could be a lot, could be not really much at all. Let's play through the I'm gonna win a game with this card sort of scenario though. I cast Complete the Circuit at instant speed, obviously. I tap down my entire team. Let's say dream scenario, I actually have 6 creatures in play and one of them is blue, which means I essentially can cast this for free. Now I may cast sorcery spells this turn as though they had flash, so I can cast an Expropriate, and of course that is the next sorcery that I am casting this turn, so I will get to copy that spell twice. So that means I will get to cast 3 Expropriates at instant speed, which of course is essentially game over, right? That is the sort of scenario where this card can be absolutely bonkers, but that is the dream scenario. You do need quite a bit of creatures in play in order for this to be free or even just really cheap. If I have to pay 5 or 6 mana for this, I'm not going to be able to cast that Expropriate immediately afterwards. Highly unlikely anyway. I really want to get into a situation with this card where I cast it when I got a bunch of creatures that I can tap down, so it is maybe 1 mana, maybe 2 mana, and then I can follow it up with a really powerful sorcery or maybe even an instant that I can copy a bunch of times, right? Copying a Cyclonic Rift, not very good here. That's not going to do anything, right? Copying an Insurrection or a Rise of the Dark Realms, those are cards that aren't very good copying them. In fact, it doesn't do anything at all. You really want specifically cards, again, Expropriate being the best example I can think of, where copying it a bunch of times is actually really helpful, but there are scenarios where you can just straight up win a game with this card. So for that reason, I think it certainly will see some play in the format. Speaking of win cons, let's talk about Ancient Empirosaur, 5 green dinosaur 6/6. Again with the Convoke, of course, a huge Convoke theme in this set, which is one of my favorite things about the set because I really like the Convoke ability. Trample and Ward 2, pretty good. Ancient Empirosaur enters the battlefield with 2+1/+1 counters on it for each creature that convoked it. Wow, that's really, really good. So not only is convoking those creatures going to make your creature cheaper to cast, but it's also going to make it bigger. So again, if we play out the scenario here, let's say I only have 2 creatures in play. I can tap them both down. My Ancient Empirosaur is only going to cost 5 mana. That's pretty good. And then it also enters the battlefield with 4+1/+1 counters on it. So now I'm getting a 10/10 creature with Trample and Ward 2 for only 5 mana. That's pretty incredible. Obviously, if I'm playing a green deck, the likelihood I have more creatures in play is great. And it can get into the sort of Dreamland scenario here where I have 7 creatures in play and I can tap down my entire team in order to cast this guy, which again is going to mean that it's free, and it's also going to mean that it has 14+1/+1 counters on it. So I now have a 20/20 Trample Ward 2 creature, right? So that's where we sort of get into the win con scenario. Having a massive trampling creature on the battlefield is great. Of course, it doesn't have haste, so you can't attack with it right away. Maybe might work better in a deck where you can give your creatures haste. Certainly any of those decks, this would be a great option for slotting in there. It certainly is a creature that I think people are going to shoehorn into a lot of their big green stompy decks because it's going to be a nice fit, but also can fit really nicely into a lot of those decks where I'm going to go wide strategy. Maybe I'm in that token strategy. I don't have a lot of great win cons, and I can tap down all my little token creatures to make a giant creature. Next up, a card, again, that I'm sure a lot of people are talking about and might have made the top 10 list for a lot of people. And again, another Convoke card, Hoarding Broodlord, 5 black, black, black. So an 8 mana card. That's pretty expensive, but again, it has Convoke, so that will bring the cost down. It's a 7/6 dragon, so it's a big creature and of course has flying. When Hoarding Broodlord enters the battlefield, search your library for a card, exile it face down, then shuffle. For as long as that card remains exiled, you may play it. Pretty darn good, but then also spells you cast from exile have Convoke. So again, we sort of have to play out the scenarios here in order to properly evaluate this card, right? A lot of people will look at this card and go, okay, 8 mana, I'll go tutor for a card out of my library, that's terrible. I guess I can Convoke to cast it for cheaper. Still not super great. This is, I think, better than a tutor, right? This is searching your library for a card, you exile it face down, and then for as long as it remains exiled, you may play it, right? It's like a Praetor's Grasp that way. Your Hoarding Broodlord can be long gone forever, and you can still cast that card for the rest of the game. Also, it is an exile not in your hand, so it can't be discarded or somebody can't wheel it away, right? It's always going to be an exile. That is important. So it's very easy for you to go get your win con in your deck, say, for example, and then you don't have to worry about it going anywhere. That can be good. Obviously, the Convoke means I can cast this guy for a lot cheaper. If I do have a lot of creatures in play, I think maybe people might think this card is better than it actually is, because you really got to have a lot of creatures in play in order to make this affordable as a tutor option, right? If I'm using this as an actual tutor to go get something I really want out of my library, even having 5 creatures in play that I can tap down to cast this, it's still going to be a 3 mana tutor. Now it's a 7/6 flyer. That's pretty good too. The spells you cast from exile have Convoke, where I guess maybe that works in a Prosper deck, right? Because you're casting stuff from exile all the time. So I think a lot of people might be slotting this into their Prosper deck because you're more now using that Convoke from exile ability, maybe? Again, it's hard to say whether people are going to be doing that or not. Obviously, the card that you've just searched for, you can cast that from exile by convoking stuff. You're not going to immediately do that because you probably just convoked a bunch of stuff to cast Hoarding Broodlord, so you're going to want to wait another turn. Are your opponents going to kill this before you can get around to your next turn? Maybe you've exiled something that costs 9 mana, like that Rise of the Dark Realms, and you're hoping to convoke it, and now someone's killed your Hoarding Broodlord before your next turn, so you're unable to convoke it. Now it's stuck in exile for a few more turns. Again, there's a whole lot of things going on there that sort of make this card a little bit tougher to evaluate, but I think for sure it is going to see some play in the format. It is a very interesting card, no question. All right, we are moving on to another card that I imagine some people had in their top 10 lists that maybe people are confused. I did not, and of course that is the new sword, Sword of Once and Future. Very interesting name, and of course it has completed this sword cycle, which I think a lot of people were anticipating, and I think a lot of people will be more excited about this card because it is completing the cycle, right? For me, I'm just evaluating this on its face as a card. So 3 mana artifact equipment and equip 2, just like every other sword in the series. An equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has protection from blue and black. So we now have the blue-black version of this card, and of course the protection's great, but everybody always wants to know what else is it doing. When equipped, creature deals combat damage to a player, Surveil 2, that's okay, not bad. Then you may cast an instant or sorcery spell with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. If the spell would be put into your graveyard, exile it instead. It's okay, all right? I don't think this is great. As far as the sword series goes in general, I don't think this would even crack my top 5. It works particularly well in certain decks, I think, where you are surveilling, right? If I want to be putting stuff in my graveyard for whatever reason, any sort of self-mill strategy, this might be good. Don't forget, you have to be getting in for combat damage with this card in order to be using it. Are you going to have an instant or sorcery spell in your graveyard that you can cast? I look at all the other swords in the series, and the ones that I really like are the ones that I am guaranteed to be getting both of those abilities, right? If I have a Sword of Feast and Famine, I guarantee guaranteed am going to be making my opponent discard a card, I guess, unless I don't have any at all, but that's highly unlikely, and I am guaranteed to be untapping my lands. If I had a Sword of Fire and Ice, I am guaranteed to be drawing a card, and I am guaranteed to be throwing 2 damage around. I don't love the ones where it is a possibility that I might not get both of these effects. You will always be able to Surveil 2 here, sure, but are you going to actually have an instant or sorcery with mana value 2 or less in your graveyard that you can cast? Are you relying on the Surveil in order to get that card? If you are, the likelihood isn't very good. It's still pretty good. It certainly is not even in probably my top 5 as far as the Sword series goes. It is going to see play in the format for sure, though, so I'm giving it a mention here. All right, next up, let's talk about Mist Meadow Vanisher. 2 in a hybrid Azorius mana, so white and blue. Kithkin Wizard 3/2. When Mist Meadow Vanisher becomes tapped, exile up to 1 target non-land, non-token permanent. Return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So we have another blinking option. Why this one is significant, I think for 2 reasons. One, and the big one, is it is exiling a non-land, non-token permanent. That can be really important. Exiling creatures is easy in the Commander format. There's a ton of options there. This is an option for exiling something that isn't necessarily a creature. You can't do tokens and you can't do lands, but everything else is on the table. That can be really important. For example, if I have a Planeswalker, right? I got Planeswalker on the table and I've minused it a whole bunch and now it's down to like 1 loyalty counter. I can use this to exile it, and when it comes back into play, it's going to be back up to its normal loyalty, right? Stuff like that you can do with this card, which is important. The other important part about this card, you can exile your opponent's stuff. That can be important as well. If your opponent has a creature, say with a bunch of +1/+1 counters on it, you can exile that creature and then it will be returned to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step, but it won't have any counters on it. And in fact, if it's one of those Hydra type creatures, it'll actually die because it'll come back into play as a 0/0. So that's a really neat way to use a card like this. Also though, the fact that it just has to become tapped. Now obviously you can just attack with this. When you do so, it will become tapped. You get to use the ability. That can be really good, but you can find other ways to tap it. And obviously in this set, there is a tapping theme, mostly because of all the convoking that's going on, right? Convoking is a great way to tap down your creatures. So obviously you can do that. There are other ways as well. So I like the option of, yeah, I can just attack with it to tap it, but I can find other ways to tap it as well. I think it's a really neat card that can fit nicely into some decks. All right, let's talk about Vulpine Harvester. 3 and a white Phyrexian Fox, 3/3. Whenever one or more Phyrexians you control attack, return target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield if its mana value is less than or equal to their total power. So this is one of those cards that people look at and go, oh right, Phyrexian Tribal, here we come. And does the Phyrexian Tribal fit really well with the artifact theme that you are fitting here? Maybe. There is a lot of Phyrexian artifact overlap, of course. And of course, if you're doing that Phyrexian Tribal, this probably would be a good fit, but let's just get away from the Phyrexian Tribal. Vulpine Harvester is a Phyrexian, and when I attack with my Vulpine Harvester, I will get this trigger, and I can return an artifact card from my graveyard to the battlefield with mana value 3 or less. That's pretty good, right? So just this card on its own, if I'm in, say, an artifact deck that I'm not really doing the Phyrexian thing at all, just attacking with this guy, I can get a mana value 3 or less artifact out of my graveyard and put it into play. Lots you can do with that, right? You can just get back artifacts that have been destroyed earlier in the game, or I can get back that Commander Sphere that I have sacrificed to draw a card. That's 3 mana value or less. I think this fits in the Phyrexian Tribal theme, sure. It also fits in a lot of artifacts decks as well, because you can just attack with this guy, but also it's likely you'll probably have a few other Phyrexians in your deck as well. Again, we have a little bit of an issue here with this set because of the Phyrexian Tribal aspect, and there's a whole lot of cards that have been errated from way back in the day that are now Phyrexians that you might not know that they actually are. That can cause a little bit of confusion. There is a likelihood that you have a card in your deck already that is Phyrexian and you don't even know it. Nevertheless, this is a card I think that can fit nicely into a few decks. All right, let's talk about Chrome Host Seed Shark. 2 and a blue Phyrexian Shark, 2/4 with flying. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, incubate X, where X is the spell's mana value. And this to me seems like a card that a lot of people might get really excited about. It certainly is good, and it certainly does fit in certain decks. I think people will make the comparison to Shark Typhoon. That's definitely where they were going at when they designed this card. Now, where it is good, I think, is in an artifact theme because you are creating artifact tokens. That can be really good sometimes where you just want a lot of artifacts in play, right? And of course, a lot of the artifacts you are casting are going to be non-creature. So I'm casting my artifacts that are then creating more artifacts. I can transform them, but I can just leave them the way they are because I just want lots of artifacts in play, right? Maybe I want to be sacrificing those artifacts to do other things. That's where this card can be really good. If I'm in that spell slinger theme where I'm just casting lots of non-creature spells and I want to get value off of them, I don't know about that scenario. It could be good, but I think the 2 mana to constantly be flipping those Phyrexian artifact creatures face up can get really mana intensive and maybe is not the best way to go here. But I do think this card can fit nicely into certain strategies, particularly in the artifact strategies. All right, let's talk about Seer of Stolen Sight, a card that I think for sure will see play in the Commander format, or should, although it is very archetype specific. 2 in a black Phyrexian Warlock 2/3 with Menace. Whenever one or more artifacts and or creatures you control are put into a graveyard from the battlefield, Surveil 1. Pretty darn good, right? Now, of course, the archetype where you have artifacts and or creatures going to the graveyard is a whole lot, right? There's a ton of decks out there, especially in black, that are having either creatures or artifacts go to the graveyard. And yes, those treasure tokens are going to the graveyard. I have clarified this in rules videos past where some people think that tokens being sacrificed don't actually hit the graveyard. Yes, they do. When you sacrifice a treasure token, it will actually hit the graveyard and trigger this card before it ceases to exist. So in a treasure token theme in black, which there are a few commanders that are doing this could be a good fit if you want to be surveilling, right? That's where the overlap sort of gets a little shady here, where do I want to be surveilling? I mean, it's good because I can look at the top card of my library, and if I don't want it, I can throw it in my graveyard. But what if I do want it, right? If as soon as I do want that card on top, now the surveil becomes essentially useless. Now I can't really do anything with it because it's only surveil 1, and I can sit there sacking treasure tokens all day long, and that card will stay on top of my library because I actually want it. If I'm in the strategy where I want my creatures to be dying or I want to be sacrificing artifacts and I also want to be filling my graveyard, that's where this card gets extra good. How many decks are there out there like that? I'm sure there's a few, and I'm sure there are some people that are going to find a nice home for this card. I think it certainly will see play in certain decks in the format. All right, next up, let's talk about Change the Equation. And I always like to talk about the new counter spell from a set and whether or not it's good enough to actually play. This one is certainly questionable, okay? 1 in a blue instant. Choose one, counter target spell with mana value 2 or less, or counter target red or green spell with mana value 6 or less. So if I'm countering a red or green spell here, I will get almost everything, right? 6 or less covers a lot. There's a whole lot of great cards in red or green that I can counter with this spell. And it's highly unlikely that I am going to be in a commander game where no one is playing red or green. I think for sure I'm going to have at least one deck that fits that. But if that's not the case, it still counters a spell with mana value 2 or less. Pretty good, not bad. I mean, it's never going to be useless. There certainly is a lot of great spells in the commander format that cost 2 or less. And then if your opponent is playing a red or green deck, you could hit some real bombs with this card. Is it good enough to see play? I don't know. I'll compare it to a card like Negate, right? Negate is a card that I still do play in the commander format. Same casting cost, obviously. Negate's going to hit all of those non-creature spells, which I like. Change the Equation can hit creatures. So obviously better against those red or green decks, because obviously I can hit those creatures as well. Then there's the scenario where my opponent casts an Esper Sentinel, and I can counter that with Change the Equation. I don't know. I don't think I'm rushing to put this in any decks. Is anyone out there, though, going to use this card? Do you think it's good enough to play in the commander format? Next up, Surge of Salvation. And I always like my protection cards in the commander format, and I think this is a pretty good one. 1 white mana instant, so it doesn't get much cheaper than that. You and permanents you control gain hexproof until end of turn. Prevent all damage that black and or red sources would deal to creatures you control this turn. So again, we are in a situation where we have a little bit of a color specific scenario, right? Preventing all damage that black or red sources would deal to creatures you control this turn can be really good, right? My opponent is attacking with their big black creatures. I can block all day and I don't have to worry about my creatures dying. My opponent cast a Blasphemous Act. This is 1 white mana. I protect my creatures from a Blasphemous Act, which of course is one of the most popular board wipes in the whole format, right? Because it's going to be dealing damage to my creatures and they're not going to take any from red sources. And then of course there's a situation that you would probably more use this for, which is you and permanents you control gain hexproof until end of turn. Now that probably sounds a little bit better than it actually is. It is very uncommon for you to be targeted with spells in the commander format. That does not happen very often. So giving yourself hexproof is going to save against some things, but not a lot of things that we typically see in the commander format, more so permanents you control. But of course, typically your permanents are only being targeted one at a time. It is very unlikely that your opponent is going to be targeting a whole bunch of your permanents all at once, unless they're casting maybe an Aether Gale. I don't know if anyone still plays that card in Commander. If they do and they're targeting 2 or 3 of your things, this can be extra good. But I think 90% of the time when you cast your Surge of Salvation, it's going to be my opponent is just targeting one of my things and I cast this and pay 1 white mana to protect it and give it hexproof. That is likely the scenario that this is going to be used for most of the time, which is not bad. It's pretty good. I think I would certainly play a Blacksmith skill over this because it's also giving that permanent indestructible, but I think it's still pretty good. And if you are looking for a protection option, this is definitely a viable one in the format. And I'm going to end off with a really interesting card here, Infernal Sovereign, 4 black, demon 6/6. Flying and trample. So we got a pretty big, nasty creature here for 6 mana, not too shabby. You got to skip your draw step though. That's not very good. However, whenever you play a land or cast a spell, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. That definitely has some potential. First of all, the very unique, interesting part about this card is whenever you play a land, you get to draw a card. That is very unique in black and might be a really good fit in a Get Rog deck, maybe. There's a deck that wants you to be playing lots of lands. There's a deck that I think you likely could be playing lands from your graveyard even. Definitely could get into some shenanigans there. Obviously, if you are getting into the shenanigans situation that people are probably thinking of with this card, the lose 1 life can be significant, right? You can't just go off with this, can't go infinite. You will eventually kill yourself. So there is that little bit of a box you're being put into here. You do have to be careful with any card that says skip your draw step. And I talked about this with Symbiotic Deployment, where I thought that was a pretty neat card in a lot of decks, but skipping your draw step can get you stuck in situations. And if you don't have anything in your hand that you can cast, now you're just sitting there and you got to get this guy off the table, right? So I like this card maybe in a deck where I have sack outlets. So I can play this, maybe even attack with it a few times, cast spells, draw a bunch of cards, play some lands, draw a bunch of cards. And then if I get in a situation where I'm stuck and I've sort of hit a wall, now I can sacrifice it, get it off the table, and then just draw normally as I typically would. I will also point out that if you're in a deck where you're skipping your draw step already, and there are a couple commanders that are doing that, this seems like a slam dunk, right? Because you're not really down anything. So if you're playing that Damia Sage of Stone deck, gotta throw this in there for sure, I think. Pretty interesting card. I'm actually curious how much play it's actually going to see in the format and how many people are actually really excited about this card. There's definitely some super interesting cards on this list and cards that for sure will be seeing play in the format. How much will they see? Only time will tell. And if you guys are interested in purchasing any of these cards from March of the Machine, I do have a TCG Player link. It is in the description below. Feel free to give it a click. It helps support the channel. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.